On June 25th, 1876, Sergeant Daniel Kniep of the U.S. Army participated in the Battle of Little Bighorn as a member of the 7th Cavalry Regiment, specifically Company C. His role in the battle was significant, and he is remembered for his courage and detailed account of the events. Kniep was among the few survivors of the confrontation. During the subsequent court of inquiry, he provided essential testimony regarding the actions of Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer in the 7th Cavalry. Following the war, Kniep continued his service in the Army and later authored a memoir detailing his experiences at Little Bighorn. This narrative, known as the Kniep story, is considered an important historical document for understanding the battle. Sergeant Daniel Kniep's valor and dedication during the Battle of Little Bighorn mark him as a notable figure in American military history. Before we proceed, we kindly ask you to support our community by liking and subscribing to our channel. Our journey began on May 17, 1876, and it would turn out to be a regrettable expedition. Please remember to like, subscribe, and activate the notification bell for more comprehensive historical insights. We headed towards the Yellowstone River and established our camp at the Big Heart River after marching 12 miles. We took some time to survey our surroundings. By approximately June 10th, we advanced to the Powder River, where 6 out of the 12 units were assigned to a reconnaissance mission. After leaving the wagon train at the Powder River, we mounted pack mules with supplies for 10 days and undertook a 2-day trek up the river. As we turned towards the Tongue River, we discovered the Indian Trail along the Rosebud River. As dusk approached, we prepared coffee and spent the night traversing the trail. In the morning, we brewed more coffee and continued our march along the route until midday. We retraced our route along the Rosebud River after General Reno, the commander of our detachment, recognized that our supply of 10-day rations was dwindling. At the junction of the Rosebud and Yellowstone Rivers, we met the remaining 6 companies of the regiment, led by General Custer, along with the department commander, General Terry. General Custer had been detained, reportedly due to his opposition to the post merchants who had received concessions at various posts, which were later revoked following scandals related to post ridership during President Grant's administration. It was nearly impossible to procure anything from the post office without first dealing with these vendors. A glass of liquor cost 25 cents, and the portions were generally small. Custer's arrest stemmed from his decision to set a maximum price for these drinks. However, he was still accompanied by other senior Army officers and retained command at the location I mentioned. On July 22nd, Custer's contingent received a supply of food sufficient for 15 days from the steamship Far West, which was docked on the river. He was also equipped with 2 Gatling guns and 2 Rodman guns, which he ultimately surrendered to General Gibbon, who believed he could manage without them by transporting them across the river. In hindsight, we view this as a significant error, as the Native Americans would not have ceased their retreat had Custer retained one of the Rodman cannons and fired it even once. They would have continued to flee, and I would not have been the only survivor had we possessed a Gatling gun at that time. In fact, the infamous Custer massacre might never have occurred. We dismantled our camp and moved throughout the day on June 22nd. That evening, Custer instructed that directions be communicated through hand signals, eliminating the use of bugle calls, and that only enough fire be maintained to prepare coffee. We commenced our journey anew on the morning of June 23rd. After marching until nearly dusk, we set up camp and continued our trek the next day, June 24th. On that day, we reached a site where the indigenous people had conducted both a war dance and a sun dance. The ground was solid and level due to their dancing, and they had built brush huts from cottonwood trees. 6 Crow Indian scouts, part of our group, discovered the scalp of a white man, which belonged to a soldier under the command of Gibbons. The Crow, who harbored animosity towards the Sioux we were pursuing, were overjoyed to see the scalp hanging from a willow branch. They erupted in celebration, shouting, dancing, and yelling. Had they found a Sioux there, it would have been a grim day for him, reflecting their fervor. The scalp was returned to General Custer, who inspected it before handing it over to the men. At the time of his death, it was stored in the saddle pockets of my company's oldest line sergeant, Sergeant Finley. On June 24th, we marched throughout the day. Around 10 o'clock that evening, the Indian scouts we had sent out earlier returned, and it was dark. In the summer, it is still light enough to read at 9 o'clock in that region. That evening, we were instructed to pack our gear and prepare our horses. We marched through the night, nearing the confluence of the Little Bighorn and Rosebud rivers. General Custer led the regiment into a gully that seemed to provide an ideal hiding spot for as long as we needed. However, as we entered at a brisk trot in gallop, Quartermaster Sergeant Hurst lost some hard bread from the packs of the supply train. Upon learning of this, General Custer directed the sergeant to return and retrieve the bread. Two Native Americans were taking bread when the sergeant arrived at the spot where it had fallen. Upon noticing the advancing army, they quickly fled. Upon returning to camp, he reported the incident to General Custer, who then ordered us to prepare our horses. I presumed he aimed to catch the Indians off guard the following morning. However, since they were aware of our presence, he opted to take immediate action. After marching up the divide, we paused. General Custer departed for 2 hours with 2 scouts and Henry Voss, the chief trumpeter. Upon his return, he divided the regiment into 3 detachments. He assigned 3 soldiers, A, M, and G, to Major Reno. Captain McDougal was tasked with leading the pack train with Troop B, while Captain Benteen was given command of 3 troops, H, K, and D. General Custer retained Troops C, E, I, and F for his own command. After leaving the area, we advanced with Major Reno positioned to General Custer's left and Captain Benteen to Reno's left. It was clear that 3 different approaches would be employed to assault the Indian camp. Captain McDougal was to guide the pack train along the main Indian trail. We proceeded down what is now known as Benteen's Creek until we reached a crossing, where we found an abandoned Indian camp with smoldering fires. One of the remaining teepees contained a deceased Native American. General Custer ordered the tepee to be burned. When Major Reno arrived, he was instructed to cross Benteen Creek, which he did. General Custer advanced down the creek with 3 companies. As we approached within a quarter of a mile of the confluence of Benteen's Creek and the Little Bighorn, I spotted Indians atop the bluffs overlooking the river and informed First Sergeant Bobo of their presence. At that moment, General Custer looked up, and Troops C, I, and F proceeded to the bluffs where the Indians had been seen. My Troop C was commanded by General Custer's brother, Tom Custer. Despite our swift ride, the Indians had disappeared by the time we reached the summit. The teepees were visible for several kilometers in every direction. Our group of Crow Indian scouts planned to stealthily approach and capture a few ponies. A handful attempted to descend, but they were shot in the process. Bloody Knife Reeve, along with Airy, Urukara, Curly, a Crow, and Chief Scout Mitch Bowie, stayed on the bluffs with us. We raced to the far end of the bluffs to prepare for an assault on the Indian camp once the soldiers from the 4 companies began shouting and making noise upon spotting it in the valley below. Sergeant Finkel was riding close to me, near Captain Tom Custer. Finkel called out that he was nearing his limit as his horse was struggling. I responded to him, "Finkel, if you can, keep coming." He pulled back slightly. The captain then directed me to return and find McDougal and the pack train to relay the orders just issued by General Custer. He instructed me to tell McDougal to move the pack train directly to higher ground, advising that they should not stop to secure any loose packs, but rather cut them off if necessary. Act swiftly. There is a large Indian camp nearby. I made my way back. Initially, I thought it was unfortunate, but it ultimately saved my life. Had Sergeant Finkel received the orders, I might not be here recounting this story, as he had retreated just moments earlier. In the distance, I could see dust rising from the pack train, resembling a small cloud. As my group and others advanced toward the Indian camp, I headed in that direction. General Custer's last words echoed in my mind. We all rode at full speed, cheering for the soldiers as they climbed the hill. Some galloped past General Custer, unable to control their mounts. "Hold your horses, boys," he shouted. "There are plenty down there for all of us." After they moved on, I rode back. After delivering the orders to Captain McDougal at the pack train, I proceeded to Captain Benteen, as I had been instructed to present the orders to him as well. Major Reno was in the process of retreating from the base of the bluffs when McDougal and his men ascended the hill to provide assistance. Behind them, the Indians were shouting and firing, causing casualties among our ranks. Before we could intervene, the Indians would pounce on the fallen and scalp them. As Dr. DeWolf reached the summit of the slope, he was killed. Had he moved forward just a few steps, he might have been spared. While I was following Captain Bentine back, I noticed some Indians rushing past. I readied my weapon to fire a few shots, believing them to be hostile, but they turned out to be scouts fleeing the main battle. They were so frightened that they continued their flight until they reached the Powder River, having abandoned Major Reno's command. After relaying instructions to Captain Bentine, I returned to the top of the ridge with the battalion, where we regrouped with Major Reno and McDougal. I was unable to rejoin my company due to the presence of Indians separating us from General Custer. Following an attack by the Indians after Major Reno advanced onto the bluffs to confront them, we were forced to retreat and establish skirmish lines. We suffered several casualties before we could reach our men, who were killed before we could assist them. The Indians continued to fire at us throughout the day and regrouped at night, remaining active until the morning of the 26th. The next morning, they resumed their assault. I cannot estimate their numbers, but we managed to inflict significant losses on them. Our camp had 68 injured men, and we were cut off from water supplies. It was distressing to hear the cries of a wounded man pleading for water, which we were unable to provide. Some soldiers were shot while attempting to fetch water and could not return with any for the injured. I vividly remember the first gunshot fired during the two-day battle. It struck the ground nearby and passed directly beneath my horse. Two officers, Lieutenants Harrington and Sturgis, along with 14 soldiers, were never found. Accounts suggest that during the nighttime celebrations, the Indians had decapitated individuals and paraded their heads. On the hill, they killed 56 members of our group. The 26th was marked by continuous gunfire throughout the day, and by late evening, we observed the camp beginning to relocate. While the women were occupied with packing, the warriors continued to shoot at us. On the morning of the 27th, there was not a single Indian in sight. We prepared coffee, gathered water, and did our utmost to assist the injured. General Gibbon and his troops arrived around 10 o'clock, accompanied by General Terry, the department commander. We greeted General Terry with enthusiastic cheers upon his arrival. Overcome with emotion, he wept openly. It became evident that General Custer and his 4 companies had been completely annihilated when he later reported seeing 200 troops in the valley below, leading us to speculate that he might have been trapped just as we were. Later that afternoon on the 27th, I was granted permission to accompany Captain Bentine to the battlefield and explore the area freely. As I surveyed the deceased, I recognized several acquaintances, including a sergeant I knew. Among the bodies, I identified Sergeants Finkel and Finley. Sergeant Finley lay at the head of his horse, Carlo, with 12 arrows embedded in him. The bodies had been exposed to the sun for 2 days, bloodied and disfigured. After the women and young Indians stripped them of their clothing, they would repeatedly strike the living men in the face with tomahawks or shoot them with arrows, making it clear which males had sustained injuries. They only inflicted harm on those who were still alive, never on the deceased. None of the bodies retained any clothing. Everything had been taken by the Indians. They likely received approximately $25,000 in cash from them as well, since we had just collected our paycheck at Powder River Camp before starting this campaign, and we had no immediate use for it. I could see where the last group had fallen. They were huddled together in a small pile. Only the lower part of General Custer's back was in contact with the ground as he lay across several men. He was surrounded by the deceased, having suffered a fatal gunshot wound to the heart. This final group was near my captain, Tom Custer, the general's brother, along with his brother-in-law, Lieutenant Calhoun, who led H Troop. Excluding the women, there were around 4,000 Native Americans involved in the conflict, bringing the total number of indigenous participants to between 12,000 and 15,000. Custer and his troops faced an overwhelming force, and no living soul remained on the battlefield to recount the events that followed the defeat of Custer and his 4 companies. Captain Keogh's horse, Comanche, was the sole survivor of the massacre, having sustained 7 gunshot wounds before being found. Among the deceased soldiers, many fallen Native Americans were also discovered. Approximately 75 Indians were located within 3 standing teepees, and it is impossible to determine how many more were removed as the Native American camp relocated. One Indian I encountered was clad in buffalo robes and blankets. I was taken aback to find that he possessed 4 women's scalps, 2 of which had long red hair hanging from a string as long as my arm when I cut him free. I quickly discarded the scalps due to the gruesome nature of the scene. not wanting to be associated with such a disturbing trophy. After the battle, we buried our fallen comrades before embarking on the arduous task of transporting the injured to the steamboat heading west. The steamer was compelled to withdraw to the Yellowstone River after reaching the furthest point it could ascend. A significant number of injured soldiers were brought aboard the steamboat for medical assistance. Fortunately, most of the wounded individuals made remarkable recoveries. Among them was the old Comanche, the sole survivor of Custer's ill-fated battle. As a testament to the events of that tragic day, General Headquarters mandated that this horse would spend the remainder of his life in a box stall. Comanche received care from a soldier of the 7th Cavalry and was paraded at the front of the regiment during dress ceremonies, draped in a black mourning cloth. In the aftermath of the battle, the Native Americans simply dismantled their camp and resumed their journey. My regiment, which had also fought in the battle, was not in a position to pursue them. We were all too severely injured and too disoriented to mount an effective counterattack. The Native Americans managed to escape without incurring further losses after achieving a decisive victory. I hope this personal account provides you with a different perspective on the Battle of Little Bighorn and the Great Sioux War of 1876. Stay tuned for more videos. Wishing you a wonderful day, and I look forward to sharing additional first-hand accounts of other conflicts with you.